The UK Health Secretary is brought down by scandal, but the country is nevertheless chafing against intrusive rules that have just become dumb. Northwestern America has been hit by a truly intense heatwave, feeding into the debate around Joe Biden's huge spending climate bills, and former President Trump's new social media platform has been launched, for real this time. My name is Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. There are two things that I'm not generally much interested to talk about. One of them is which politicians got caught sharing intimacies with people that they shouldn't have been. So towards the end of last week, it feels like a lot longer ago for some reason, when the UK Health Secretary Matt Hancock had video footage of him in a passionate clinch with his attractive female assistant who was not his wife, when that hit the newspapers, I didn't much want to care. I mean, such things are a personal tragedy for the families concerned, but things often happen in politics. I don't excuse it. Actions have consequences. There are, after all, 6 traumatised kids involved in that particular story. Still, it's generally their business, not mine. But here it's different, because here Matt Hancock had overseen the intrusion into everyone's lives. Many people supported the policy, of course, but that didn't stop it being an intrusion. We've been told who we can and can't hug. We've been told that we can't visit dying grandparents. We've been told we can't have weddings with more than a handful of attendees, and so on, into excruciating detail. And Matt Hancock was the person doing the telling. So this led to the inevitable media frenzy. Initially, Prime Minister Boris Johnson tried to resist on the counter playbook that Dominic Cummings had taught him, that you don't give in to the media mob, but that was never going to hold in this case. Everybody who is now deeply frustrated with the restrictions in their life was utterly furious that Hancock, the main person who'd been telling them the minutiae of how to live their lives, he'd done that while doing whatever he wanted to in private. He made a feeble stab at resisting the obvious conclusion, but even before the Sunday newspapers had unleashed on him, as they were doubtless gearing up to do, he'd bowed to the inevitable. Now, ironically, in a common sense world, he should have been free to grab his lover however he wanted. He'd had COVID some time ago. He'd also been double vaccinated. I assume that she's been vaccinated as well. In a common sense world, sex, drugs and rock and roll should be one of the benefits of getting that protection. We do not live in that common sense world, and that's at least partly down to Matt Hancock. And there was a case for it before. But now the cracks in the logic are really showing. We've now vaccinated a majority of the adult population and all of the ones in the vulnerable categories. You then have to come to the realisation there is nothing else to do. The virus isn't going to disappear however long you stay locked down. There is no argument you can now make to stay locked down for any longer, the logic of which doesn't keep you locked up forever. We should by now have moved to the phase where we have to learn to live with it. Now, this is hard. People have been scared for so long. For some, it's a real wrench. Just seeing a bunch of people in close proximity not wearing masks, such at Wimbledon or at a football crowd, it gets a visceral reaction of moral outrage for some people. It's not going to go away quickly. People have been trained to have a disgust reaction from things that used to be normal, and those things need to be normal again. The trouble is, we are still living with a legacy of stupid rules. The more intrusive a policy you have, and the larger scale that policy, the more unintended consequences are going to kick in. Because there's no leeway for common sense judgment to be followed. Just follow the letter of the law or else. So we have a crisis in schools now because of the bubble system. All the kids are split into groups. One kid gets COVID. The entire bubble has to go into quarantine for an extended period. And it's keeping large numbers of kids frequently out of school. For at this point, huge damage to them for no logical reason. National health staff who have had 2 jabs are still being required to self-isolate if they've been in proximity with a COVID positive person. They've been double vaccinated, they get a flow test showing that they're negative, but the rules say they have to isolate, and hospitals are completely unnecessarily put under huge pressure when they have a massive backlog of non-COVID patients to get through. The hospitality sector, finally allowed to open, is being brought to its knees again because suddenly half of their staff have to isolate for 10 days and they just can't stay open. It's not solely a UK madness. The EU vaccine passport, for instance, will refuse to recognise people who have been fully vaccinated with AstraZeneca vaccines if they were manufactured in India. Now, it's the same vaccine as those that are made in Europe and the UK, but it hasn't yet been authorised by the tortoise-paced European Medicines Agency, so them's the rules. And there are fights going on about whether the EU should blanket require British travellers to quarantine whether they've been vaccinated or not because of fears from the widespread Brexit variant or something. All of this now is the illustration of incompetent governments who brought in overly specific and intrusive policy when it could at least be arguably justified by the then current circumstances, but who are now clinging onto those measures as they thrash about trying to make sense of the world as it changes around them. We are not where we were 6 months ago. We have better treatments, meaning fewer people die from COVID, and we will keep getting more of those. And the vulnerable can be vaccinated annually if need be, just like they are with the flu. Now we need to live our lives. Dying from COVID will be a smaller risk than dying in a car accident, and yet we get into cars all of the time. Now that doesn't mean it's all done, and COVID-19 isn't a problem anywhere. We have real problems in different parts of the world. Australia is significantly locked down again as it's dealing with a surge associated with the Delta, what we used to call the Indian variant. It is particularly vulnerable because, of course, its success to date was based on hitting it very hard and early and achieving zero COVID, and then adopting a Fortress Australia policy. Now, unfortunately, the short-term success of that policy led to something of a lack of urgency on the vaccination front, so now Australia remains pretty much as vulnerable as ever if infections do now get out of control. All the signs are that North Korea is having serious problems, with Kim Jong-un firing senior aides for failing to keep the virus out of the country. Firing them out of what hasn't been specified, but punishments don't generally stop at the sack. Countries that were depending on Russian vaccine diplomacy are finding themselves in trouble because many of the promised shipments failed to arrive or were much smaller than promised when they did. Guatemala, for instance, was promised 8 million doses but has received only 150,000. And these weren't donations, they paid Russia $80 million. Now Guatemala, unsurprisingly, has asked Russia to pay back the advance payment. Argentina, Mexico and the Philippines have also reported delays in Sputnik V vaccine deliveries. In total, Russia promised 896 million doses of vaccine to other countries. As of May, it had exported 15 million doses. And Russia now says that it's concluded it needs all of its own vaccine to deal with its own people. I said before, the fact that Russia and China were quick into vaccine diplomacy, going to various countries and offering vaccines that they couldn't get from elsewhere, was because you had two systems who believed that they didn't much need to worry about the sentiment of their own populations. That may still be the case with China, but Putin in Russia is feeling a bit more heat right now. Only 11% of the population have been vaccinated, and a recent surge in COVID cases because of the Delta/Indian variant has created a surge in demand from a concerned population. Yes, leaders do need to take action in that sort of situation. Still, you can't imagine Putin telling his people that they can only have a drink in a bar if they're eating a Scotch egg, one of the micro-detail debates that the UK had in the past. Now, in a minute, we'll look at heat domes and the launch of Trump's new social media platform. But first, one of the things a lot of people in the US and the UK have been talking about lately is a thing called critical race theory. People on the right point to a toxic teaching that if you're white, you're automatically privileged and racist, about how encouraging meritocracy is just another form of white supremacy, and how rather than furthering the cause of genuine anti-racism, because it makes everything about race, it's making things a lot worse, not better. But now some on the left have started to kick back against that. They're saying, that's not what it's about at all. It's just those crazy right-wingers making stuff up. Critical race theory, the real critical race theory, is much more nuanced and valid, and it's not being pushed through schools at all. Well, what's really going on here? If we listen openly to the best arguments on both sides, can we get to any sort of helpful insight on what is critical race theory? Is it hurting or helping in the quest to bring about a world without racism and discrimination? That's what I'll be looking at in the next video, going live on this channel on Monday at 7 PM UK time. Join me then. There are two things I'm generally not much interested to talk about. One of them is the weather, at least as it relates to climate change. I do not indulge the frankly tedious habit of some on both sides of the climate change discussion of jumping onto every instance of hot or cold or wet or dry weather and making some kind of point out of it. Yes, climate change is a thing. Banging on about it incessantly every time there's a hot day just makes you kind of annoying. However, this week it's hard to avoid the fact that an instance of short-term weather has achieved a degree of justifiable prominence in the national discourse. The record-breaking temperatures from the heatwave over northwestern US and Canada has been remarkably unusual for those parts of the country. I don't think anyone would dispute that. And it's been significant as much for timing as anything else, with Joe Biden poised to seek to pass a huge spending infrastructure bill with major elements in the name of climate change. With power cables melting in Portland, numerous deaths being reported strongly suggested to be from the heat, which is what you would expect in an area where, few people have got air conditioning if it gets to those extremes. Biden touted his bill that includes $50 billion for building resilience to extreme weather events. I mean, you couldn't get more topical than that, to be fair. But the moment also emboldened critics within Biden's party complaining of the climate measures that got dropped in negotiation for a bipartisan deal on infrastructure. For example, Democratic Senator Ed Markey said this: "I've said all along, no climate, no deal. The bipartisan framework doesn't get us there. So I agree with our leadership that this must be resolved in reconciliation. Until then, I'm still, no climate, no deal. Let's get this done." Reconciliation, of course, is the process whereby financial bills can go through the Senate with only a standard majority rather than the 60% majority needed for most bills. In the meantime, various climate scientists have been making public statements saying that however difficult it can often be to attribute individual extreme weather events to the impact of human-caused climate change, the current situation was about as close as you could get. Andrew Dessler, for instance, said this: "There's no question that climate change is making this heat wave worse. None. Zero. Nada." But at least there was a lot of discussion on more practical questions. I mean, these are areas where people don't routinely have air conditioning. So how often does an event like this have to happen before that changes? A lot of the harm of extremes comes from their landing on places that are not prepared for them, are not used to them. If this is a once in 100 years event, then no one's going to much worry about it. If it happens, it's awful for a while, you deal with it, it goes away. Obviously, there's a possibility with rising global temperatures that such events become more common, but we don't know. In which case, on a practical level, if it did, then every building's going to standardise with air conditioning, the electric grid is going to have to be built to cope with the demand and the impact of the heat on its infrastructure when it happens. That's probably some fairly expensive adaptation there. Remember, some of the climate skeptics like to go on about how there was this wonderful medieval warm period where they were growing wine grapes in East Anglia, where I live in the UK. Well, that's great for me. I will happily drink that wine, nicely chilled in the glorious hot sunshine. Can't wait. But do remember that during the exact same period, the west of the United States went through many decades of mega drought. So let's hope that events like this are going to remain highly unusual. Shouldn't run around flapping your arms about in panic because it happens once. And if that's not the case, then yes, some serious work needs to be done to work through the consequences. Will that prospect be enough to galvanise governments elsewhere in the world? Well, if not, they may get a push anyway. France's top administrative court has given a new example of the judiciary pushing government on climate change. This week it ruled that the French government isn't doing enough to fight climate change and ordered that it take all necessary measures to curb the curve of greenhouse gas emissions. It gave it a deadline of March the 31st next year to do this, which by amazing coincidence is a month before the presidential election. If the government doesn't fall into line with the court's instruction, then it could start issuing fines. The move comes just a month after Germany's Federal Constitutional Court made a similar ruling, pushing the government there to produce concrete plans by the end of next year, which, seems a bit more leisurely in comparison now to that French ruling. Whether government policy by judiciary is quite the great idea that some people think it is, remains to be seen. But the courts may well continue to be an important battleground for this. Various groups have been pursuing companies over climate change in the courts, trying to hold them responsible for what the campaigners suggest is their contribution to the global problem. Indeed, according to a report this week, over 1,500 climate-related lawsuits have been brought worldwide. The report observes that the campaigners have been struggling because their approach to attributing blame to individual companies is turning out to be based on less than robust methodology. Still, I think we can predict that one more stab at one specific company is definitely on the cards, because Greenpeace carried out a sting on an ExxonMobil lobbyist who's represented the company at Congress for 8 years. They pretended to be headhunters and covertly recorded him as they got him to admit that the company had used third-party organisations to lobby against legislation on climate. More recently, he'd lobbied senators to remove or diminish climate change measures from President Biden's $2 trillion infrastructure bill. And he said Exxon had secretly joined shadow groups to promote climate change denial messages.
Did we aggressively fight against some of the science? Yes. Did we join some of these shadow groups to work against some of the early efforts? Yes, that's true. But there's nothing illegal about that. We were looking out for our investments. We were looking out for our shareholders.
He also suggested that ExxonMobil's public support for a carbon tax is underpinned by the conviction that it will never happen, allowing the company to support it in order to appear green. The company has been quick to protest. It said this: "We have supported climate science for decades. Greenpeace and others have distorted our position on climate science and our support for effective policy solutions." There's no suggestion that any of this was illegal under lobbying laws in the United States. But you can be sure that campaigners will be seeking to use these admissions as the latest weapon in their attempt to nail Exxon through the courts, as they try to frame things like ecocide as a retrospective crime that they could use to bring people to book. Now, in other news, former President Trump's long-promised social media platform, a proper one, not just a blog this time, has finally launched. It's called Getter, Gettr. Sounds a bit like, Twitter. And it looks a bit like, well, to be honest, it looks exactly like Twitter. So Getter's mission statement was announced to be fighting cancel culture, promoting common sense, defending free speech, challenging social media monopolies, and creating a true marketplace of ideas. At the time of shooting this, Trump himself wasn't yet on the platform, and puzzlingly has apparently declared that he isn't involved and he has no plans to join. Well, some have suggested that sounds suspect. Possibly Trump knows that if the platform is associated with him from the start, it will be unable to attract the broad base of usership that it would need to be successful, because a lot of the people who would be active on social media simply wouldn't join it if it was launched as the Trump show. But of course, once it's in full swing, he could join later, and then it would be just like Twitter again, except that they couldn't throw him off. If that's the plan, it seems unlikely to work, since it's by no means clear why anyone except Republicans will feel the need to move from Twitter to a Twitter clone. And, people do know that it's Trump's advisor that has launched this. There's a website, there's an app live on both Google and Apple stores. You wonder how long that's going to remain the case once Trump gets active. So anyway, it looks like it's been properly designed. As I said, it is a Twitter clone. However, I repeat my prediction again for the avoidance of doubt, it's going to fail. I don't say that because I necessarily want it to fail, even though it would prove me wrong if it doesn't. I will cope with that humiliation if it comes. But as a social media platform, the free speech alternative to mainstream social media, that concept will only take you so far. A respectable number of Trump supporters and a few others who want to observe the antics will join. That will be enough to show some robust early growth, but it won't ultimately be enough to support the market dynamics you need for a successful social media company. Not with that mission. Not once Trump is on it getting into his stride. Because remember, he shut down his personal blog website, reportedly because it wasn't getting enough traffic. It could morph into a political campaign vehicle. It will not be a successful social media platform. And by the way, I speak as someone who set up an account on Parler. It's not as though I'm against the principle. Now, in a minute, we'll reply to comments and talk about YouTube censorship in the comments sections. But first, it's time for the July livestream. I think I'm getting the hang of live streams. The last one was almost technically smooth. And of course, we covered some interesting topics. Now, obviously, we all know that what I just said has got the smell of hubris and premature delusions of competence all over it. So the next live stream is guaranteed to have some massive snafus. Nevertheless, I will be looking at some topical issues, inviting feedback and lively questions. I really appreciate how we built something of a community of skeptical and dangerously reasonable thinkers on this channel. So join me for that live stream, become part of that discussion. 7 p.m. UK time next Wednesday. See you there. I had kickback from several people in the video on mRNA vaccines, mostly from defenders of Robert Malone. Here was one. I am sceptical that Brett Weinstein got taken in by a con man. This was my perception of your tone in the video. Interesting that whistleblowers are shown to be somehow not credible. There were various other flavours of the same. Several accused me of an ad hominem attack against Malone. It's interesting to note how different the responses get to those videos when you step into highly contested polarised territory. The number of people misreading and misinterpreting what I said seems to go up, as do the number of generalisations of principle. So of course, nowhere do I suggest Malone is a con man. It's not even remotely what I said. The only way you end up there is if you can only perceive people as heroes on the one hand or villains on the other. So if you offer up a shade of grey, which is like every other human being, you're going to measure the shade and paste it as either black or white or nothing in between. And no, making a criticism of someone on a relevant matter is not in itself an ad hominem attack. I do wonder sometimes at the phrases people throw around apparently not really understanding their definition. An ad hominem attack is when you ignore someone's argument and then simply seek to undermine them by attacking their character or their credentials. But I discussed his argument. I evaluated it. I pointed out the peer-reviewed paper that supported part of it, while also highlighting the lack of research evidence to support the other part of it. That is the opposite of an ad hominem attack. The only excuse for this channel is that I insist on exploring the shades of grey and to aim to do so in a relevant and fair way. Now, if I get it wrong, as I will do from time to time, by all means point out the mistake. You can call me an idiot while you do so if it will make you feel better. But try not to get offended just because I see shades of grey where you'd prefer to see whiter than white versus the blackest of black. By the way, the whistleblowers comment. There are no whistleblowers in this discussion. Again, focus on the meanings of these phrases. A whistleblower is someone on the inside of an organisation who sees malpractice and draws attention to it. That is not Robert Malone. He is a knowledgeable critic. An equally valid role in principle. Don't get me wrong on that. Just not a whistleblower. All right. I got lots of good feedback generally on Wednesday's update video. Lots of people encouraging that format as something that could be done regularly, maybe on a once a month basis. So thank you for that. I also got several people pointing out an update that I missed. I mentioned that when I did the ivermectin video, I'd not used the Tess Lorry meta-analysis because it was carried out by a partisan group and hadn't been published in a peer-reviewed journal. And that was true at the time, but a number of people pointed out that it has now been published, just a couple of weeks ago in fact. And others also pointed to the criticisms that group and others had made of the newly published meta-analysis that I did talk about for multiple alleged errors. So this is where we are. It is a live argument, two different purported meta-analyses, both with weight behind them, but actually both with question marks over them as well. I say again, when it gets to this point, I am not going to pretend I have the knowledge of the field to make a judgment. But I come back again to the fact that major clinical trials are in progress and we will get better answers when they report. Someone accused me of being anti-ivermectin and pro-vaccines. And yet I just see all those shades of grey in everything I've said about both of those. For the avoidance of doubt, I have a favourite actress, Scarlett Johansson. I have a favourite tennis player, Andy Murray. I do not have a favourite drug of choice for COVID-19. I'm interested to know what works, and that means evidence, high quality evidence, not the first scrap that goes away you wish that it would do. All right. Now, rather than the short thought this week, there is something else that we need to talk about, because it's becoming impossible to ignore that some of the comments made on videos here don't stick for reasons best known to YouTube. Here's one example that I recorded when it happened. I get a notification of a comment, looks like an interesting comment I would like to respond to. I click on it and it's not there. In the past, I assumed the commenter had thought better of it and decided to delete their comment after they posted it. But it's become obvious that YouTube just deletes some comments. In my video management setup in YouTube, there are some comments that are held for my review because they might be a bit dodgy. But those disappearing comments never end up there. They just disappear. One of my commenters had a long comment of his disappear over and over, so he did the experiment of breaking it up into 4, and one of those disappeared while the others didn't. Why? I mean, he finally managed to post it by disguising the words, and I look at it and I ask, YouTube, why? I mean, I can't figure it out. Look, we're all grown-ups here. Leave the comments alone. If someone's abusive, I'll deal with it, but generally people aren't. I mean, I framed the rules for discourse on this channel, and although people occasionally test the boundaries, mostly not, and I can't remember when I last had to act on them beyond a gentle request to tone something down when someone was responding to another commenter. We're responsible adults. We don't need nanny YouTube to protect us from what nanny believes to be bad speech. Unfortunately, Nanny continues to do that, and also to protect wider YouTube audiences from videos on this channel. However well these videos perform with existing audiences and subscribers, YouTube still resolutely refuses to show them more widely in the way that it used to do up until about 3 months ago. Now, it hasn't gone further than that. There's been no strikes on contents of this channel, which, can never be taken for granted because these things sometimes seem to have an arbitrary element to them. Brett Weinstein has had his channel fully demonetized recently, so that's a major chunk of income for him that YouTube just wiped out at a stroke. I also mirror the videos here on the Odyssey service, so if you're on Odyssey, do make sure that you're following me there. But mostly, we're just going to keep on working to get around a broken algorithm in the belief that if you produce good content with interesting, relevant and topical analysis, then we will find ways to reach the audience. And of course, I'm able to do that because of the good people who support this channel on Patreon. I really wouldn't be able to put the time into producing 3 videos per week without that support. And I certainly would have much stronger incentives to self-censor to try to avoid the controversial topics that YouTube seems to hate. If you would like to join those people helping me to produce the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to provide here, please go to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.